The inspiration behind this video are these flowers that my girlfriend made for me a while back. Since Valentine's Day was coming up, I wanted to reciprocate what she had made for me by putting my own spin on it. So I decided that I was just going to make the same thing, but bigger and made out of wood. Because of course I would. I went with extrapolating the size of the bouquet by a factor of 10. Rounding these numbers to the closest fraction gave me an OD of 7/8 and an ID of 3/8. This made it a bit easier since I could just purchase 7/8 inch dowels and drill holes into them with a 3/8 inch brad point bit. The idea was to cut these dowels using the crosscut sled and drill holes into them to give them a bead-like shape. The only dimension that wasn't exactly the same as the glass beads of my girlfriend's bouquet was the round over on them, but ain't no way I was gonna try routing these beads cause I'm not trying to die anytime soon. Making the holes in the beads was a bit challenging, mostly time-wise. I'm definitely sure that there's some way to save on time by making a jig to drill these holes, but the main challenge was that the circular shape of the dowels made it so that there needed to be something clamping onto the wood, or it would bite the drill bit and spin out. But anything can be accomplished given enough time. So using a pair of pliers, I drilled holes one by one into each of the 400 beads. It was really just a sweatshop simulator experience, to be honest. Painting the beads was actually not that bad. I know that I probably should have painted the dowels prior to cross-cutting them, but I was afraid that tear out from the table saw would ruin the paint job, so I opted to paint the beads after they were cut. I made a silly little jig consisting of 3 pieces of 2x4s, screwed together and with wire threading through them. This let me thread the beads through them and held the beads in the air so that I could spray them down. But thank goodness my girlfriend only used 3 bead colors, because I didn't realize that spray paint is just a bit kinda expensive. Also, I learned that it's definitely not a smart thing to try and balance a large board on a single sawhorse, because consequently, I spilled all of my red beads onto the pavement. Now came to the part where I actually had to assemble the beads into something resembling flowers. I opted to go with aluminum wire since anything steel related would be way too hard to work with, and I extrapolated the size from 0.3mm to 10 gauge, or around 2.5mm diameter. Figuring out how the flowers were assembled was kinda difficult because it was hard to see how the flowers were actually put together, since they were just so small. But after a couple of YouTube videos on bead making and squinting until I started to hallucinate where the beads actually were, I was able to kinda figure out how the flowers were threaded on the wire. Putting together the beads was a lot better than actually making the beads, since the process of making it was just a lot less tedious. A lot better than drilling 400 holes into cut up dowels that might spin out on you. To make the stem of the flowers, I first threaded a single bead on a wire and folded it in half at that point. Then you could load the rest of the beads on the 2 folded wires. The single bead threaded through the wire served as a stop block for the rest of the beads being loaded on. After mounting all of the green beads, it was time to actually make the flower part of the flower. This part was a bit more complicated to figure out, but also not too complicated. Basically, the pattern was threading a single bead through the 2 wires, then separating the 2 wires and pulling 1 bead on each, and then threading these 2 separate wires into a single bead, and rinse and repeat. Finishing my first bluebonnet was kinda satisfying since I could see my first flower come together. Since I wasn't following a guide or anything, I really didn't know how the flowers were going to end up besides just imagining them in my head. Sometimes I think that I have a good idea in my head, but I don't actually know if the idea is a good idea until I actually do it in real life. You know? So thank goodness my wooden beads worked out, because if they didn't come together or looked half decent, I would have probably crashed out. It was just good to know that the hours I spent prepping and making the beads paid off, since they actually kinda work and look kinda pretty good. Making the flowers was not bad once you figured out the wiring pattern. In my girlfriend's bouquet, there were 2 types of flowers, a bluebonnet design and a red flower design. The bluebonnet flowers were a lot more simplistic than the red flowers since they didn't have as many loops. On the other hand, the red flowers had a leaf on the stem and also contained a lot more beads than the bluebonnets. The red flowers were definitely a lot more complicated because of its loops. The red flower stems also had a leaf in the shape of a loop as well. To make a loop, I had to take a single wire and thread on around 11 beads. and after that to loop the wire back through the very first loop, and that would give either a leaf or a flower petal. Figuring out just how much wire I needed was a bit tricky. Since I never made these flowers before, I didn't know how much wire was needed, and I wasn't going to spend the time to calculate the wire length due to the variation in lengths for the wires looping around. The bluebonnet flowers were not that bad since it was easy to gauge how long the flowers would end up, but the red flowers were again a bit trickier. This was because one side should be longer than the other side, since this longer side would be used to make the flower petals. But the question was just, how much? My general strategy for approximating the red petals was just to pull out as much as I thought seemed like was enough and then adding a bit more, just in case. Consequently, I may have overestimated. Pulling like 10 feet of wire through the beads may have been a bit strenuous on the forearms. Even though I was using aluminum wire to thread the beads on, I still had to depend on pliers for many sections of the wires, especially when I had to make tight loops in some places of the wire so that the beads would sit correctly. Most of the times I used pliers for these flowers was when I cut the excess wire off and needed to curve the wire into a loop to hide it. Even though the aluminum was pretty easy to work with, the flowers still struggled with holding their shape, especially with the red flowers since they were so top heavy. They had a habit of bending over with the slightest movement, so I reinforced the stem sections of all of the flowers using some steel wire that I had. I just thread the steel wire through the beads and let it give it a bit more rigidity. As you can see here, the red flower with the steel wire inserted into it holds its shape much better than the flower without the steel. Sometimes I think it's crazy how the steel wire seems so much more sturdier than the aluminum, even though the two wires look so similar from the outside. Sometimes I wonder why this is, and sometimes I wonder why I didn't pay attention in my materials class. But anyways, after I inserted the steel rods into all of the flowers, I could start building the bouquet using the finished flowers. I thought about using some thin floral wire to wrap the flowers, but I thought that some ribbon would look a bit nicer. And ribbon also allowed me to put a lot more force on tightening the flowers together. I intentionally tied a really big bow on a flower so that I could undo it in the future so I could wrap the wire coming from the bow that I would put on the bouquet. The final step in finishing the bouquet was to build the bow and to mount it onto the flowers. Making the bow was a little bit challenging to figure out, but after some messing around, I figured out that the bow was basically two loops, these loops being similar to the leaf and petal loops. But the difference here was that I had to stick the wire through the last bead, and this basically built the tail of the bow. And looping this loop back into the loop held the entire bow in place. So at last, I had the bow shape made with two wires sticking out, and this let me wrap this bow around the bouquet. Overall, I thought this was pretty fun. Maybe not making the beads part, but the actual process was kind of fun. But anyways, that's pretty much the process of making wooden bead flowers. So now all I have to do is surprise my girlfriend with them. So, bye!